Okay, welcome back. This part of the lecture, we are going to start talking about affecting your stems by using routing techniques. And the first thing that I want to do, as we know that we're dealing with two decks, we're dealing with deck A and deck B of our two respective tracks over here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create two tracks on the right-hand side that I can route all my stems to. These will be like master processing channels that I can actually use effects to globally affect those decks. So I'm going to create a new track by right-clicking and inserting an audio track, and I'm just going to duplicate these two. And to just be clear, I'm just going to rename these. So Command R, and I'm just going to call this deck A. And I'm going to call this deck B. Cool. So now what we need to do is we need to route this information here, the kick, the drums, all of these steps, as well as these steps, into their respective decks. So obviously what we want to do is we want to mark these, deck A and deck B, so that we could use our crossfader if you so choose. This is obviously completely up to how you want to route this and work with this. But I'm going to press Command Alt and I to look at my ins and outs, and I want to route all of this into deck A. So I've selected all of them by using Shift, and I'm going to go to A2, and I'm going to scroll all the way down to deck A. Can you see that I actually created a deck A channel, and I'm routing that. And I don't have to do that individually. As you can see, I've done that by selecting all of them. I'm going to do the same thing with deck B. So select deck B, just scroll down. And now we are routing the audio correctly, but remember, we are not going to get any information. You can see that audio is playing, but at this point in time, no audio is obviously reaching deck A over here, based on the fact that our monitoring status is set to off. If our monitoring status is set to in, then you'd be able to see that we are starting to route audio directly. So remember, your monitoring status needs to be set to in. Okay, so now that we've got that set up, the most important thing is we need to actually go in and find the effects that we feel will be the most valuable to us in terms of globally affecting the specific music that we are routing through these decks. I tend to mirror exactly the same, the same effects on both decks, just to kind of keep some kind of symmetry, especially when I'm dealing with, any kind of like filtering, like EQ filtering, or low pass filtering or high pass filtering, just standardizing the effects. And what I would definitely suggest you do is actually setting up, something that you will always kind of look to, the most important effects that you will always look to in terms of DJing or in terms of performing live. So what are those effects? Well, if I actually open up my browser over here, I can actually go to my audio effects, and just as an example, I could use an auto filter. So there's my auto filter. This is my cutoff frequency, and you can decide whether you want a high pass filter, a low pass filter, whatever works in terms of how you want to affect your tracks. Another good idea would also be setting up some kind of delay. So you can obviously set up an echo or a delay. You could also use that for your return tracks. Another thing that you could consider possibly is a little bit of additional processing, maybe just a touch of compression or something like that. But essentially, like, I've already prepared an audio effects rack that I will show you now. So obviously play around with in terms of the effects that you want, whether you want chorus or flanger. That is completely up to you, and that is and you obviously understand the process of how to group effects to create a rack. And that's what I would definitely try and hit home, is the fact that it'll be better for you to actually turn these into effects racks so that you can actually just collapse them. So Command G is obviously to group them, or you can right click and select the group option, and now you'd be able to actually access your macros, and then you'll obviously make your macro mappings accordingly. And then you could obviously collapse whatever's in there, and then globally control the effects that you want in those particular channels. Okay, so I've grabbed a couple of my effects racks that I've designed, and just to kind of give you an idea of what I'm after when I'm performing, and what I could use in terms of global effects. So I've got a bit of this track over here that we were dealing with in the previous video, and we could just have a look at the basic macros over here. So I've got my 3-band kind of filtering system. So I've got my gain for my low end, my mid-range, and my high end. And to be 100% certain, when you're dealing with mapping any kind of parameter, you need to be 100% certain how this will behave once you've made that macro mapping. And just as an example, if I expand this rack, and it's quite a large rack, but the first device you'll see is the EQ3. And the EQ3 can actually exceed 0 dB in terms of the low, mid, and high gain. And the issue with that is, if you just make the macro mapping itself, and you're not actually defining the minimum and maximum range of the macro mappings, you will find yourself in a situation where you would possibly be boosting a specific frequency range without intending to do so. So if I collapse this quickly, and I just grab an EQ3 from my audio effects over here. So we could just go to EQ3, so EQ, and there is the EQ3 device. So just as an example, here is my EQ3. I want to group this, so I'm going to select the group option, or Command G, and that groups it into a rack, an audio effects rack, and we could start making macro mappings. So I'm going to map this to macro 1, and as you can see, this dial is actually showing me what 0 dB is, but we actually can push the gain further. And the problem with that, obviously, is your track is going to now have more low end than you intend, and that's going to be a problem. So how do we alleviate this problem? Well, it's very simple. We click on the map button over here, and you'll see that your browser turns into your macro mapping, like minimum and maximum range. And we can decide to set a minimum range, but I'm interested in just setting this to 0 dB. And now obviously if we go back to our specific macros, you can see that this dial cannot exceed 0 dB. So we've set a cap basically at 0 dB, so we can only subtract and not add. And that is something that is very essential to the process of defining exactly how you want to affect your content. So I'm just going to get rid of this, and I'm just going to expand this device again. So we've got our EQ3, and then we've got a low pass filter, so we can obviously use the cutoff frequency to generate to kind of shave off between tracks. So generally, if we're thinking about techniques that DJs use, moving from one track to another, you could use techniques of filtering once you start kind of placing emphasis on the new piece of music that you're introducing in your set, and the old piece of music kind of starts fading out. So that is essentially like the, you know, a basic DJ technique that that is always used. Another effect is called the metallize. So the metallize is basically a very fast delay. So if you think about setting a delay at like a, you know, a very, very small millisecond, you know, value, time-based value, as opposed to a beat subdivision, and you set the feedback to about past 70%, you will start generating like this kind of almost you know, this textural metal kind of granulizing kind of effect that would you know, kind of just make the contents that you're sending through it resonate in a specific way. And you know, in synthesis they call this the car plus strong you know, technique. And you know, you can generate tones from it as well. You can create like kind of interesting tonal sounds from it. But yeah, essentially this is a very fast delay. Then we've got a gator, which is actually just you know, a set of auto pan set to different values, you know, to gate at specific values. And then we've got a beat repeat, which I call the beat masher, and then fade to gray, which is a combination of filtering and delays. But, you know, instead of me just talking about it, let me just show you what this does. So I'm just going to zoom out and play a part of this track. Here we go. So, obviously, mid-range, controlling the highs, the filtering, the metallize effect. You can hear that really fast delay generating some kind of interesting artifacts. The gator, you know, so let me just play that again. Let me just zoom out and play this again. So you can actually hear that like this is now, you know, at quarter notes, that would be 16th notes. You know, so you can kind of gate like your longer synth sounds, you know, so it depends on the content that you're sending through it. The beat masher. So you can actually hear at specific values, the beat repeat actually picks that up. Okay. And then the last one is the fade to gray. This is a great effect. Let me just play this once more. So you can hear that it's filtering, but it's also feeding delay. Okay, cool. Yeah, so that is essentially like the first set of effects that that I've got, you know, in my set. The next set, you know, has like additional kind of overdrive and enhancing the stereo and adding a bit of compression and so on. I mean, but the most important thing is you don't need to reinvent the wheel either. What you can do, instead of having to kind of start this process of building an effects rack from scratch, is you can obviously go to Live's browser and you can just go to the audio effects section here, and we can go to the top and we can have a look at the audio effects rack list. And then we can actually go to performance and DJ, for example. You can expand this, and then you can start dragging in any of these racks. As you can see, graphically, it's showing you what a audio effects rack looks like, or what a rack looks like. You can see graphically over here that you're dealing with more than one device, and we can just at any time, you know, kind of drag any of these in, and then you'll see we've got macro mappings set up for us already. So I can obviously play a specific part, and you can start kind of you know, trying to kind of see what works, you know, which effects work. So that's not really a great example, but you know, you'll be able to actually go through here and find something that works, you know. You know, so that is that's quite an extreme effect, but you can see that you can add like some weird filtering motion. That's obviously like auto pan. But the point is that you can actually go into this entire menu here, and you can find something that works for you. You also have the ability to go into the Max for Live library over here, and you can go to audio effects here, and you can start looking for various like Max for Live audio effects that you would want to try. So for example, I don't know, like I've got this tape stop over here, so let's see what that sounds like when I engage it. So maybe in between tracks, if you want to drastically sound like a tape is actually, being switched off, or your reel-to-reel is slowing down, or your vinyl is busy like slowing down, you can actually generate that type of sound with some of these Max for Live effects, So the tape stop is really cool. I would definitely say just spend some time to actually really think about how you want to affect your content. That being said, another thing that we obviously also spoke about quite extensively was using follow actions, and also using clips to just set up specific sets of automation. So as you know, our monitoring status for our two channels over here, deck A and deck B, is set to in, which means any audio content or any audio pasted on these specific clip slots as clips will not actually pass through the audio, because it's prioritizing what is being sent to it from other channels. So, but that doesn't stop us from actually drawing in automation to actually at specific parts in our performance when we launch these scenes, or if we want to launch these as separate clips, having specific set automation written in or dialed in, so therefore we don't always have to have control, like physical control, over all of these parameters. We can actually draw in automation, and at a specific point in time, we can actually have any of these effects kind of ramp up or kind of affect our output. So to kind of hit this point home, the most important thing is obviously we can't just double click to create a clip over here, because we're dealing with audio channels. We are interested in just working with a little bit of silence. What I tend to do is I just grab any audio clip that I have existing. So I'm just going to grab this vocal and effects clip. I'm just going to copy that over by holding Alt in and dropping it in here, and you'd be able to see that Ableton shows us, in terms of the clip being translucent, that this will not pass any audio. So let me just press stop here just to prove my point. So I'm going to press play, and even if I find a part in this clip that actually houses audio, see, it's busy supposedly passing audio through here, but it's not playing any audio based on the monitoring status, which is set to in. So that means that I can now use this to just draw in some automation. So I'm just going to select a region of silence. So I'm just going to use the Command L function, and I'm just going to set a basic 4-bar loop. So I'm just zooming in here, and instead of me having to deal with a massive clip of audio that's not necessary, I've just selected this little region over here, and I'm going to right click. I'm going to select the crop sample option. So now that region that I've selected with the loop bracket has now cropped that empty clip of audio. And now with that empty clip of audio, I'm just going to rename this to, let's say, call this low cut. So maybe as this effect, I would like to, set an envelope to my first parameter in my audio effects racks, the gain low over here. So I've selected this parameter, and as you can see that there's a bracket around that. So the bracket is now showing me that if I go back to my clip and I've selected my envelopes, remember you can either select between your sample or your envelopes. Once I select my envelope, you can see that I can adjust the macro that I've selected, because the last thing that you've selected that you can set automation or modulation to will pop up as the first thing on your envelopes view. So that's an easy way to access a specific parameter instead of having to go through an entire list of devices, and there's a lot, so it's easier just to kind of select the parameter that you want to set automation to. So let's test this out. So now we can draw in an envelope. So I can set this to a low cut, and just to make sure that this is set back to its maximum value. Once we are launching the scene, for example, I can now launch this, and now you can see that we've created an automation, an automation parameter in terms of an envelope that we set up via something called a dummy clip. So this is known as a dummy clip. So dummy clips don't voice any audio or MIDI information. It just houses automation or modulation data. So that is why they call it a dummy clip. And the most important thing is also you can decide how these clips behave. So at this point in time, this will be an indefinite, action based on the fact that this clip is looping, and it's never going to alleviate the automation that we've set up for it. But you could also disable the loop, and you can have it, maybe drop out for 4 bars, and then on the 5th bar, it can actually, return back to its original value. So we can obviously adjust that over here by just creating a couple of breakpoints here. I'm just going to set the end point maybe just past bar 5. So for an entire 4 bars, we will drop out the low end, and then it would return. So this is a different way that the clip will behave. So let's try that. So I'm just going to go back here, bring my gain back up here, and just launch the section. So I'm just going to launch it now. 2, 3, 4, 2, 2, 3, 4, 3, 2, 3, 4, 4, 2, and we are back. Okay. So there we go. That is already kind of giving us interesting ways that we can kind of generate some automation. So as long as you have the idea that you don't have to be actively controlling every single parameter, you can draw in automation that at any point in time you can either launch as part of your scene. So when you launch this as a scene, you want this to drop out at that point, or you can actually have a set of parameters that isn't part of your scene that you can use a separate controlling surface, or maybe even hotkeys. And we are going to get into that right now. We're going to get into MIDI mapping and key mapping very soon. But you can actually have effectively a set of automation clips, dummy clips that you can actually just set up to launch whenever you feel like it. In my set, for example, I do have a low cut button. I generally use if I don't have more than one controller, then I use my brackets on my keyboard, and if I press the left bracket, then you know, I'll do like a low cut, and if I press the right bracket, then you know, I bring the bass back, for example. You know, just like basic key mapping things that allow me easy access to fundamental parameters that I've obviously set up, you know. So let's see how we can do this. So obviously we've launched this because we physically had to press play on this parameter or on this dummy clip. Let's see how we can map this differently. So I'm just going to go out of the I/O just to, you know, kind of make this a little bit more understandable. And I'm going to go to something called key mapping. So if we have a look at the top right hand side of the window, we've got key and MIDI. So by default, I can actually, you know, use, you know, any MIDI controller and hard map specific parameters or specific buttons on that MIDI controller, you know, so it's not actually natively like just speaking to Ableton via a remote script, but it is actually just a standard MIDI device. So any standard MIDI device can be mapped, and then those parameters will be hard mapped, which means they can't be mapped to more than one parameter at a time. But the way that the push controller and all these other you know, newer controllers work is they work with MIDI remote scripts that allow you to use multiple pages and use the same button for various parameters. So it really depends on your workflow. You know, sometimes you want one button to only perform one function so that it makes sense to you in terms of how it behaves. You know, sometimes having too many options gets a little bit cumbersome in terms of, you know, your understanding of how you get around to your performance. But let's start with key mapping first. So if I click on the key button over here, you can see I've already mapped a key over here. So that's the backslash button over here that allows me to select this particular return track, for example. But for this example, I am going to use the low cut button over here. So I'm just going to map this to, let me just go in here. Just be certain that you are not using the computer keyboard as a MIDI keyboard in this instance. And I'm just going to select my my bracket next to the P button over here, my bracket over here, to engage this low cut, you know. And an easy way to go in and out of key mapping is you can press Command K. Command K allows you to move between key mapping and not key mapping. And it is now as simple as testing it out. So I can press play on this clip. I'm going to press the key that I've mapped, you know, and at any point in time I could obviously relaunch that, you know. And we can also think about how this would behave. As you can see that, you know, by default, your clips will quantize to a specific value before it actually launches. And that has to do with the launch quantization at the bottom here. So we've got our clip and then our launch box that we spoke about, follow actions, if you remember. But I'm speaking about clip quantization. If we set this quantization to global, then we would have to have a look at the global quantization at the top here next to our metronome. And it is set to a single bar. So if I launch that specific clip that I've now mapped the key to a little bit out of time, or, you know, a little bit ahead of the time, it's going to wait for an entire bar before it launches so that I make sure that that clip launches exactly in time. Now, when you're dealing with audio, that is a very good thing because you're not going to be launching audio content out of time or out of sync, which, you know, is completely understandable. But if we're dealing with dummy clips, for example, this is just an effect, it's not going to be such a bad thing to actually possibly consider changing your quantization value to possibly a different node value, or you could even set it to none. So if I set this to none, and let me just set this back, I'll have to map that later, but just to kind of prove this point, what we can do, I'm actually going to I'm going to set two I'm going to create two mappings here. I'm going to duplicate this, and this one is going to be low cut, and this is low cut off, for example. And I'm going to key map this. So what is the hotkey? Command K, and I'm going to map the button next to that to map that button over there. And I'm going to make sure that I set this device parameter back to its default value. So now I've got two mappings over here. I've got low cut and low cut off, and they're both set to quantization value none. So now I'm going to just play around with the two buttons over here while the track is playing, just to kind of prove my point. So you don't have to quantize these values if you don't want in terms of how they launch. So let's try this out. So now I've got a lot more control when I feel that I want to drop out the low end or whatever parameter I have mapped over here. I have complete control over, bringing that in or taking it back out. I'm not bound by a specific number of bars. But if you want to be much more precise, then, by all means, you can select more than one clip if you wanted to, and affect their launch quantization values. Let's try quarter notes, for example. So let's try this again. So you can see it takes a bit of time. So according to the quarter notes, it's actually now going to, it's going to kick in after a specific, quarter note, depending on when you launch that. Okay, so that is key mapping. Key mapping is really great. It's extremely useful, and I use it all the time because that means that you don't have to have another controller surface. Now, let's go into using MIDI mapping. So I will just pause this for a sec, and then we're going to get into some MIDI mapping. Okay, so we are talking about MIDI mapping now. And we're still dealing with this effects rack that I've got here, but I have my launch key, my Novation launch key set up here, and I just want to be certain that my MIDI device that I'm using, my MIDI controller surface, has actually been set up correctly. So I'm going to go to my preferences, which is under live, and preferences, or command comma, which is easier. And, this obviously has a MIDI remote script if I wanted to use this device, to perform multiple functions with the faders and the knobs on this device. But I just set this up as a standard MIDI controller. So you can see it says launch key MIDI or launch key in control. So I've disabled all the in control functions because I want to hard map as if I'm using a MIDI controller that does not have the capability of performing multiple functions per dial or per button. So at this point in time, I set up my inputs and outputs to track and remote. I'm not really interested in the sync functionality. And the most important thing is when you actually press any MIDI button or turn any MIDI parameter dial or, fader, you'd be able to actually see at the top right-hand side corner, this lights up. So this is receiving MIDI messages that I'm sending to it. And that allows you to actually see that you are in fact sending MIDI into Ableton. So now that that's set up, I can close my preferences, and now I'm interested in going to the MIDI map button. So I'm going to press the MIDI map button to go into MIDI map mode, and now I'm going to hard map any of these parameters. So I'm just going to go through different faders and map them. And once they are mapped, I can press Command M, so you can go in and out of MIDI map mode by pressing Command M, or obviously just pressing the MIDI button again. Another thing also to bear in mind once you start making all your mappings, your key mappings, or your MIDI mappings, if you are in that specific mode, whether it's key mapping or MIDI mapping, if you open your browser, then you'd be able to see all the mappings that are set up. So you can see I've got multiple MIDI mappings set up for this live set, but you could obviously select the specific device parameter that you just mapped to be able to actually easily access what you just mapped and possibly define a specific range or whatever kind of relates to that specific parameter, so you can define the range. Okay, so I'm going to go out of MIDI map mode. Now I've got control over the specific device parameters, and that is now hard mapped, which means these specific faders that I've now used to map these parameters will only perform that specific function. So that is the difference between using a MIDI remote script, like I said, or hard mapping a specific device parameter. So let's say we are in a situation where we are running out of dials, or we are running out of faders on our controller surface, but we want to map a specific key on a keyboard, for example, to perform a function in terms of engaging a specific effect on our macros, or any device parameter for that matter. And I'm just using the metalize for this example. And what I want to do is I want to map a keystroke over here to engage and disengage the metalize parameter. Now, obviously, we are dealing with a dial where we're dealing with the regular resolution of MIDI, which is 0 to 127. But, we just want to be able to actually engage a specific value and then be able to switch it off as well. So at this point in time, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back into my MIDI map mode. So I'm going to press MIDI map, and I'm going to select the device parameter and press C-2. And generally, it's a good idea to actually map a key that you will not be using to be able to play a specific instrument, so it's a good idea to kind of think of a specific range that will not be interfering with your performance, because effectively that key will now be disabled and perform that one function because it's being hard mapped. And we can obviously open up our browser, which is now like our minimum and maximum value assignment for our mapping window. And I'm going to engage a range of, let's say, 73 and 0, and I'm going to go out of MIDI map mode, and now by pressing that button I can now switch the device parameter on or off, which is really a great way of kind of utilizing keys on your keyboard, for example, on your actual piano keyboard, for various functions, so you're not bound by, if you are in a situation running out of space in terms of your dials or your knobs or your buttons. You can obviously map keys as well to, specific functions. So in the next tutorial, we are now going to move beyond just working with audio and audio effects, and we are going to start incorporating MIDI, and especially for the performance that was planned for the 25th that has now been postponed. We are going to actually start approaching how we can actually incorporate MIDI and perform with our drum rack. So that's going to be in the next video.